Hello, everybody. Hope you guys are well. I wanted to pop on here a couple things. First, I've read probably through a little bit less than half of Father Nicolaos Ludovicos' Analogical Identities, the Creation of the Christian Self, Beyond Spirituality and Mysticism in the Patristic Era. And I think it's fascinating. And the question is, why would we want to get beyond spirituality and mysticism in the patristic era? I mean, spirituality and mysticism are kind of one of the key reasons people find and appreciate orthodoxy. And I think he makes a compelling argument of why we need to get beyond these two kind of modes of understanding. The first few chapters this first chapter talks about the conception of the modern self, right? And he situates this conception back in the time of Augustine and Origen. And he talks through how we can think of the modern understanding of the self that eventually led to the Nietzschean understanding of the will to power. So the first chapter is really about the ontology of power, and there's a lot there. The second chapter is about Saint Maximus and how Saint Maximus really opened up a pathway for a kind of patristic Christological understanding of the self. But I'm not going to get too far into it. I'm going to do a video talking through those couple chapters in preparation for my talk with Father Ludovicos. Hopefully I'll be publishing that next week. So I'm excited about that. I really love this book, and it's kind of right up my alley. And a lot of my subscribers are into, philosophy and psychoanalysis and postmodernism through an Orthodox lens, which I think is rare and missing from the zeitgeist these days. And there's a lot to be said there, but I'm going to leave that for now. I wanted to introduce William Stringfellow to you guys. So this book here, William Stringfellow, An Ethic for Christians and Other Aliens in a Strange Land. Now, this was written in 1973, I believe it was, and Stringfellow is a very interesting background. I wasn't too familiar with him before. This was kind of introduced on a talk that I saw, and I would highly recommend if you YouTube the Royal Path, you'll see a talk between Cyprian, Father Turbo Qualls, and the runner of that channel, talking through a lot of different things. They have about 4 released episodes. They're about 2 hours each. And in one of the episodes, he kind of mentioned in passing William Stringfellow in this book, An Ethic for Christians and Other Aliens in a Strange Land. And he remarked how it was so poignant and prescient and relevant to our time today. And getting the book and reading through it, I could not agree more. So what I'm going to do here in terms of an introduction, I'm going to read chapter 4. Some parts of chapter 4, and this might be a little bit clunky because I didn't prepare kind of stopping points. And then if I have time, I'm going to read through the last 3 pages of the conclusion, which succinctly wraps up what the kind of the book, the thrust of the book, and also gives pathway forward through hope and living in these strange and challenging times in terms of being a Christian, because the book it really digs into and delves deep into the economy of the powers and principalities, and how the America, rather than being kind of a city on the hill or an instantiation of the New Jerusalem, is a fallen principality. And he makes the analogy and the comparison to Babylon. And so the book is really heavy, and if you read it kind of without the appropriate context, it could be really, really depressing and scary, actually. But I found it very encouraging and providing some hope. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from this particular section here, which is entitled, it's chapter 4, is entitled Stratagems of the Demonic Powers, Demonic Tactics and the Prevalence of Babel. So mind you, as I read through this, I'm going to read, there's 8 tactics that he discusses here. The 8 tactics are, and keep this in mind in terms of what's happening right now in 2021 in America, in terms of the strategy and the stratagems of the demonic powers and how relevant these distinctions are in our time. And he was writing this, 50 years ago. So I'm just going to start reading the chapter here, chapter 4. And again, I'm going to go through each of the tactics, and I'm going to read the kind of the first paragraph in each tactic, but there's a lot more there. And I would suggest, if this interests you, picking up this book. It's rather cheap, and it's somewhat easy to find. So again, William Stringfellow, An Ethic for Christians and Other Aliens in a Strange Land. So starting the reading here, chapter 4, Stratagems of the Demonic Powers. If the powers and principalities be legion, so are the means by which they assault, captivate, enslave, and dominate human beings. Yet all of the demonic claims against human life, for all their number and variegation, and in spite of their dynamic qualities, and even though they sponsor chaos, have a common denominator. Typically, each and every stratagem and resort of the principalities seeks the death of the specific faculties of rational and moral comprehension, which specially distinguish human beings from all other creatures. Whatever form or appearance it may take, demonic aggression always aims at the immobilization or surrender or destruction of the mind, and at the neutralization or abandonment or demoralization of the conscience. In the fall, the purpose and effort of every principality is the dehumanization of human life, categorically. Demonic tactics and the prevalence of Babel. I do not attempt here any exhaustive account of the ploys and stratagems of the powers that be, but I do cite some of the most familiar as a matter of illustration, and moreover in order to underscore the significance of the verbal element in the tactics which the principalities mount against human beings. That the verbal factor is so prominent among multifarious stratagems is related directly to the fact that it is the human mind which is being contested, and that it is human conscience which is being threatened by the demonic. Indeed, I regard the verbal as definitive in all the ploys of the principalities. So the first tactic, the denial of truth. A rudimentary claim with which the principalities confront and subvert persons is that truth, in the sense of eventful and factual matter, does not exist. In the place of truth and appropriating the name of truth are data engineering and manufactured, programmed, and propagated by the principality. The truth is usurped and displaced by a self-serving version of events or facts, with whatever selectivity, distortion, falsehood, manipulation, exaggeration, evasion, concoction necessary to maintain the image or enhance the survival or multiply the coercive capacities of the principality. Instead of truth as that may be disclosed empirically, the principality furnishes a story fabricated and prefabricated to suit institutional or ideological or similar vested interests. All right, skipping to, the second strategy discussed here is doublespeak and overtalk. The preemption of truth with prefabricated, fictionalized versions of facts and events, and the usurpation of truth by propaganda and official lies are stratagems of the demonic powers, much facilitated by other language contortions or abuses which the principalities and authorities foster. These include heavy euphemism and coded phrases, the inversion of definitions, jargon, hyperbole, misnomer, slogan, argot, shibboleth, cliche. The powers enthrall, delude, and enslave human beings by unstopping comprehension and doublespeak, as Orwell named it. Skipping through to tactic number 3, secrecy and boast of expertise. Secrecy and boast of expertise. An aspect of the delusive aura enveloping the demonic powers is the resort to secrecy. Secrecy in politics is dehumanizing per se. Political secrecy begets a ruthless paternalism between regime and citizens, which allows human participation in government and renders human beings hapless against manipulation by trick or propaganda or other babble. Nowadays, Americans are told that secrecy is an indispensable principle of government. Frequently, that claim is embellished by plans of expertise, that is, the assertion by a principality, like the Pentagon or the CIA or the Kissinger operation, that certain affairs are too sensitive or too complicated for human beings to know about or act upon. All right, next, tactic number 4, surveillance and harassment. Remember, he was writing this in 1973. Ancillary to secrecy in politics and commerce and in other realms is surveillance and the abolition of human privacy. The prevalence of industrial and commercial espionage, the monitoring of shoppers and elevator passengers and similar now commonplace so-called security precautions affecting ordinary business, the everyday atmosphere of apprehension in which people have come to live in America, all have worked to enlarge greatly the tolerance of citizens towards political surveillance and the loss of privacy. The kind of open society contemplated by the First Amendment seems impossible, and what is more ominous, seems undesirable to many, very many Americans. So there is little outrage when Senate hearings expose illegal military oversight of civilians, or when the unprecedented political espionage in the Watergate is exposed, or when education, if that is what can still be called, is conducted in so many schools in the presence of the police or other quote-unquote security forces. Skip into tactic number 5, exaggeration and deception. In certain situations, principalities act or overact so as to engender a belief that their conduct is warranted, though no empirical justification exists. It is the audacity of the deceit, the grossness of the falsehood, the sheer excessiveness of the stratagem, the massiveness of the exaggeration which works to gain public credence or acquiescence. Skip into number 6, cursing and conjuring. The demonic powers curse human beings who resist them. I mean the term curse quite literally, as a condemnation to death, as a damnation. In earlier times, American Indians were cursed as savages in order to rationalize genocide. Somewhat similarly, chattel slavery involved cursing blacks as humanly inferior. In more recent American experiences, the most effectual instance of cursing probably has been the official defamation of the Black Panthers through indictments which conjures images of the bloodthirsty black revolutionaries. He goes on, and there's a lot of references, obviously, to the time he was writing in, but as you can see, they've kind of be even more relevant today, I would argue. All right, stratagem number 7, usurpation and absorption. A somewhat more subtle tactic with principalities initiated against humans who do not conform involves the usurpation of human resistance in various ways. No more may be done than a public ritualization of demonstration and official response. But as has been said over and over again, and once was the civil rights movement, that can be enough to neutralize a protest. Or far more elaborate schemes may be implemented by the powers that be, as the emerging and expanding role of government in recent American political trials show. And he goes on to a lot of examples there. So stratagem number 8, diversion and demoralization. It must be borne in mind that any effort to designate and describe or illustrate characteristic ploys of the principalities is artificial to the extent that it necessarily abstracts a particular stratagem from the havoc and frenzy within which all the powers exist and act. None of these techniques or tactics can be sharply defined. They all overlap. And moreover, they most commonly can be cited in simultaneous use. The matter is, of course, further compounded by the intense relationships among the principalities, by their multiple rivalries and apparent collaborations, as much as by how many of the powers besiege humans all at once. This is most pertinent to those ploys which have a distracting or diversionary aspect. That is illustrated by the political importance in contemporary American society, as has previously said, the commercial sports. So he goes on there with some more timely examples. And then a little bit here. Let's see, should I read a little bit more here? I'll read this kind of section entitled The Violence of Babel. All of these snares and devices of the principalities represent the reality of Babel. And Babel is the species of violence most militant in the present American circumstances. Babel means the inversion of language, verbal inflation, libel, rumor, euphemism, and coded phrases, rhetorical wantonness, redundancy, hyperbole, such profusion in speech and sound that comprehension is impaired, nonsense, sophistry, jargon, noise, incoherence, a chaos of voices and sophistry and tongues, falsehood, blasphemy, and in all of this, Babel means violence. Babylon is the city of Babel. The language and liturgies of emperor worship in imperial Rome were Babel. The Nazis practiced Babel against the Jews. Babel spawns racism. In 1984, Babel is the way advanced technocracy dehumanizes persons. By the 1970s in America, successive regimes had been so captivated by Babel that Babel had become the means of ruling the nation, the principal form of coercion employed by the governing authorities against human beings. I'm going to skip a little bit here. Babel has many, many other violent manifestations than the noise of technology. Essentially, Babel targets the faculties of comprehension, sanity, and conscience, which distinguish human beings from other creatures. All persons and all governments, political regimes, and similar authorities have been reminded of that of the remarkable Nobel address of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Quote from Solzhenitsyn: "Let us not forget that violence does not exist by itself and cannot do so. It is necessary interwoven with lies. Violence finds its only refuge in falsehood. Falsehood, its only support in violence. Any man who has once acclaimed violence as his method must inexorably choose falsehood as his principle." All right, quick recap before I move on to the conclusion here. So the 8 stratagems of the demonic powers are the denial of truth, doublespeak and overtalk, secrecy and boast of expertise, surveillance and harassment, exaggeration and deception, cursing and conjuring, usurpation and absorption, and diversion and demoralization. There are 3 sections left in that chapter. I read a little bit from the violence of Babel. There's also the state as preeminent principality and the Antichrist in America. But I wanted to move to, and I don't want to make this video too long, so I'm going to read from the conclusion here. The chapter 6 is the last chapter, and it's entitled "The Efficacy of the Word of God is Hope." And the subsections are the gift of discernment, the particular charismatic gifts, the political character of the gifts, and then the final section here is vigilance and conclusion, which I will read here for you guys, if you guys are still with me here. I know this is a little bit heavy stuff here, but I think it's important. At the outset of this book, mention was made of the need to comprehend America biblically, and of the further need for human beings in this nation to live biblically. These are not grandiose matters, but straightforward issues which point to the unpretentiousness of the Christian task or to the humanizing character of the biblical witness in history. Thus, the issue of biblical ethics is not expressed in vain efforts to divine the will of God in this or that particular situation. On the contrary, biblical ethics asks how to live humanly in the midst of death's reign. And biblical politics, therefore, as it manifests resistance to the power of death, is at once celebration of human life and society. Or by the parable, biblical politics means the practice of the vocation to live as Jerusalem, the holy nation, amidst Babylon. Biblical living honors the lifestyle of the people of God set out for us in the Bible. A spontaneous, intimate, and incessant involvement in the biblical word as such, that is, Bible study, is the most essential nurture of contemporary biblical people while they are involved patiently and resiliently in the common affairs of the world. Biblical living means, concretely, practicing the powers of discernment, variously perceiving and exposing the moral presence of death incarnate in the principalities and powers and otherwise. And biblical living means, moreover, utilizing the diverse and particular charismatic gifts as the ethics and tactics of resistance to the power of death, and the assurance that these gifts are in their use profoundly, radically, triumphantly humanizing. Biblical living discloses that the ethical is sacramental, not moralistic or pietistic or religious. The identity of the ethical and the sacramental is perhaps most obvious in liturgy, where liturgy retains biblical style and scope and content, where liturgy has Eucharistic integrity and is not an absurd theatrical charade disguising the idolatry of death. But the sacramental reality of the ethical is also enacted empirically, day by day, transfiguring mundane politics by appealing to the presence of the Word of God in all events. Biblical living involves, as has been cited, a converted sense of time, a transposed perception of history. The biblical mind beholds history as the epoch of the fall and recognizes time as a dimension of the death experience. Biblical faith, unlike philosophy or ideology or religion, breaks out of the confinement of linear conceptions of time and confounds sequential doctrines of history. The biblical witness concerns the transcendence of time and the consummation of history, the end of time and the fulfillment of history, freedom from time and the redemption of history. Biblical insight encompasses all things as if in a moment. So in the same event, in any happening whatever, there is the moral reality of death, and there is the incarnation of the Word of God, the demonic and the dehumanizing and the power of the resurrection, the portents of the apocalypse impending and the signs of the imminence of the eschaton. In the timely coincidence of the apocalyptic and eschatological, biblical people live in vigilance and consolation. Biblical living means watching for and hoping for the next advent of Jesus Christ. Biblical ethics, when all is said and done, concerns his dominion on behalf of human life over time and history, or in other words, the doctrine of Christ as Lord of time and history. Biblical politics has to do with acting now in anticipation of the vindication of Christ as judge of the nations and other principalities, as well as persons. So here and now, biblical people live and act, discern and speak, decide and do, in expectancy of Christ's promptness. The excited imagery and revelation of the second coming of the Lord with mid-air apparitions and other marvels may be cause some to dwell upon the text literalistically, to fix upon the wonders rather than upon the excitement of hope. But we can be saved from so demeaning the second coming of Christ if we see that, for all its mystery, the second advent is faithful to the mission of the first, and is no disjuncture or disruption. On the contrary, it is the consummation of all that has transpired in Christ's ministry in this world, from the homage of creation rendered to the Christmas child, through the undoing of death's temptations in the desert, to the secret of every parable and the authority of every healing and exorcism, unto the day alone on the cross, condemned by the principalities and powers, abandoned by everyone, consigned to death, until the resurrection. Biblical living is watchful for the consummation, but does not strive to undo the power of death, knowing that death is already undone and is in no way whatever to be feared and worshipped. Biblical living originates in this consolation. The politics of death in America, which younger citizens apprehend so strongly in their withdrawal or their cynicism or their despair, and of which American blacks and Indian Americans and other non-whites have so long and so variously been victimized, and which have consigned the white majority classes to bemusement and consternation, and which has so pathetically dehumanized presidents and other nominal leaders of the nation, is not a uniquely American problem. According to the Babylon parable, this represents a specific historic manifestation of the essential condition of all nations and other principalities. In its historicity, death as social purpose is not only the moral reality of the present American regime and society and culture, but it is the inheritance of the nation. It relates back through all American generations, so that the massacre at My Lai or the infanticide at Jackson State or Kent State are comprehended as the implementations of the death ethic evidenced in American origins and genocide against the Indians. The present usurpations of the constitutional system by incumbent authority, jeopardizing the rights and protections of all citizens against the state, are beheld as further instrumentations of an original impairment of the Constitution inherent in the institutionalization of chattel slavery. Among so many things, the plunder of the American environment, in and of itself apocalyptic in its proportions, even if there were no other apocalyptic dimensions to the contemporary American scene, is known to have its sanction in the American death idolatry, which bestows precedence upon property over human life. So the fascination with the moral power of death has always been in the nation. It is not just lately materialized. In times of apparent triumph or glory, as in the ostensible victory over the Nazis' totalitarianism, or when the automobile became commercially feasible, or with the advent of technology, as well as in times of obvious crisis and failure, as in the Vietnamese War, or in recurrent ecological disasters, or in the ghetto riots, it has been present. These are factual and analytical statements. None of them are volunteered as depreciations, as put-downs for America. Beyond their factual and analytical justification, they are theological statements. The nation is fallen. Americans exist in time in the era called, biblically, the fall. America is a demonic principality, or a complex, or constellation, or conglomeration of principalities and powers in which death furnishes the meaning, in which death is the reigning idol, enshrining in multifarious forms and guises, enslaving human beings, exacting human sacrifices, capturing and captivating presidents, as well as intimidating and dehumanizing ordinary citizens. Though history vary, though particular facts be different, the same basic theological statement, by the virtue of the biblical word, can and must be made about every nation. What then? Is there no promise for America? Is there no American future different from the present or from the past? Is there no American dream except nightmare? If America is Babylon, and Babylon is not Jerusalem, confounding what, all along, so many Americans have been told or taught and have believed, is there any American hope? The categorical answer is no. The answer informed by the biblical witness is no. The answer for those who are Christians is no, and therefore the answer which Christians commend to other human beings is no. The audacity of human beings who are Americans in the present national circumstance to utter that no is, paradoxically, the signal of a lively hope, a hope transcending America's bondage to death. It is a hope wrought in realism about this nation, a hope which confronts the fallenness of the American principality, a hope which confesses the nation's death idolatry, a hope emancipated from moral naivety about any supposed unique destiny for the nation, a hope freed from vainglorious delusions that America is a holy nation. The courage to say no, in this sense, is in itself a radically humanizing experience. It is a no which verifies a waking conscience, not an idiosyncratic exercise, but an expression of commonality with the whole of human life and a vocation responsible to all other human beings in the face of the ubiquity and versatility of the power of death at work in the principalities and powers of this world. It is the no of conscience which, imitating and preserving the biblical way, Christians sacramentalize in baptism, as the epistle attributed to St. Peter has reminded all men. This no is the no of resistance to the power of death, where, as those who resisted the Nazi totalitarianism have shown, resistance is the only way to live humanly. From this no issues the only hope worthy of human beings, because no to death incarnate in the nation or in any other appearance means yes to the gift of life. So from death arises new life. Suffering issues in celebration. To be ethical is to live sacramentally. To discern apocalyptic signs heightens the expectation of the eschatological events. In resistance, persons live most humanly. No to death means yes to life. During the Babylonian captivity, the psalmist cries out, "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" The answer is heard in the jubilation of the heavenly chorus at the doom of Babylon. And then he ends it here with this quote from Revelation. That's why I'll end it with you guys as well. It's from Revelations 21:2-6. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who has sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. Also he said, Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Thanks for listening.